So before we begin the webinar on our latest report, Disorderly and Inhumane, the Biden administration continues to expel asylum seekers to danger while U.S. border communities stand ready to welcome. I want to introduce today's panelists, Kenji Kisuka, Jessica Corley, and Hannah Hallenberg. Kenji Kisuka is an Associate Director of Research and Analysis for the Refugee Protection at Human Rights First. He supports the organization's efforts to promote the protection of refugees, reform U.S. asylum law, policies and practices, and bring other U.S. immigration policies and practices into line with international refugee protection and human rights law standards. Jessica Corley holds a master's degree in education and has worked with families in a variety of settings, including schools, social service programs, and healthcare settings. Her immigration work has included the site coordination of JASI, the Jewish Asylum Seekers Initiative, Albuquerque Faith Works Asylum Program Coordinator, and as the 5-site consulate coordinator, representing 5 organizations in Albuquerque, New Mexico, providing direct services to asylum seekers. Hannah Hallenberg is Hope's Border Institute's policy specialist. She co-leads the Frontera Welcome Coalition along with El Paso County Office of New Americans, and also focuses on research and advocacy around the root causes of immigration. So first up, we'll have Kenji speak, and then we'll follow up with Jessica, and then we'll finish with Hannah, and then with a Q&A section again. Thank you, Kenji, for being here.
Thank you so much, Diego, and thank you to Hope Border Institute for hosting this webinar today. 2 weeks ago, Vice President Harris visited El Paso. She told reporters that the administration is committed to a, quote, orderly and humane, end quote, immigration system. Yet this administration continues to use an illegal policy of blocking and expelling asylum seekers at the border, one that it, in fact, inherited from President Trump. That is neither. The continued use of Title 42 to block access to the U.S. asylum system and return migrants and asylum seekers to danger in Mexico is sowing confusion and subjecting families and adults to inhumane violence. It is far past time for the Biden administration to fully restart asylum protection at our borders. The report released today by Hope Border Institute and Human Rights First is based on research conducted by our teams in Ciudad Juárez and El Paso in the days leading up to the Vice President's visit. We wanted to understand the impact of the Title 42 expulsion policy on the families and adults who continue to be blocked in or expelled to Ciudad Juárez at a time when thousands of beds in migrant shelter networks are empty in El Paso and nearby communities in New Mexico, and volunteers are standing by ready to help welcome those in need. Here are some of the key aspects of the report. Violent attacks against people expelled to Mexico under the Title 42 policy continue unabated. Since President Biden took office in January 2021, Human Rights First has tracked over 3,200 reports of kidnapping, rape, and other violent assaults on migrants and asylum seekers who've been expelled to or blocked in Mexico due to Title 42. In Ciudad Juárez, we were particularly concerned to learn that despite efforts to increase migrant shelter capacity there, people expelled by the Department of Homeland Security have been kidnapped just after they are forced across the international bridge from El Paso. Multiple asylum seekers reported that they were kidnapped or otherwise preyed upon as they wandered the streets near the port of entry in Juárez looking for a safe place to sleep for the night. Other asylum seekers who have suffered persecution or other targeted violence in Mexico are also being blocked from protection at ports of entry, including Mexican asylum seekers fleeing for their lives after the murder of family members and continued threats by cartels in Michoacan and other parts of the country. Transgender women from Central America who are blocked from seeking asylum at U.S. ports of entry due to Title 42 also reported suffering violence and discrimination in Mexico. In addition, in early June, the administration restarted its senseless and cruel practice of transporting asylum seekers hundreds of miles by plane to El Paso from other areas of the border, and then expelling these families and adults to Mexico. Dozens of Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan asylum seekers were expelled to Juárez on these so-called lateral expulsion flights from Del Rio, Texas. They reported being held in crowded Customs and Border Protection facilities with dozens of others in the same cell, and then transported in shackles on planes to El Paso. U.S. immigration officers lied about where they were going, claiming that in El Paso, they would be able to begin the asylum process. Instead, U.S. immigration officers forced them across the international bridge to Juárez. These lateral expulsions not only place asylum seekers at additional risk of attack because they are being sent to dangerous areas of the border where they have generally never been before, but they also undermine the supposed justification for the Title 42 policy to avoid holding people in congregate settings and causing additional spread of COVID-19. The Title 42 expulsion policy is also pushing asylum seekers to attempt multiple, often dangerous crossings between ports of entry to seek safety in the United States. And US immigration officers are contributing to the confusion asylum seekers face by telling some that they can try their luck and attempt to cross between ports of entry. A Salvadoran asylum seeker said that when she approached Customs and Border Protection officers at the limit line on the international bridge, on one of the international bridges between El Paso and Juarez, the officers told her that asylum was not available and that she should hire a smuggler to assist her. A Honduran man said that while he was being expelled by the Border Patrol, an agent told him that he might have better luck crossing at night. When he tried to cross the border again, he was abducted and held for 2 weeks by kidnappers who threatened his family and said that they would dump the man's body in a bag in the trash if the family refused to pay ransom. As our research found, the Title 42 policy is anything but an orderly and humane process for people trying to seek protection at the southern border. A number of reports have indicated recently that the Biden administration may exempt families from Title 42 expulsions in the coming weeks, but that single adults would continue to be expelled and blocked from asylum. This piecemeal approach to complying with US refugee law does not comply with the law and will continue to place the lives of people expelled to Mexico in jeopardy and will exacerbate existing disparities in access to asylum. Many asylum seekers from Africa and other countries who have fled long distances are not able to flee with their children, and they will be blocked from access to asylum at ports of entry merely because they are traveling alone, as will LGBTQ individuals and LGBTQ families, who are often denied legal recognition as families in their countries. Under a Title 42 policy that continues to block adults from asylum, LGBTQ families are likely to be separated at the border, with one parent allowed to seek protection with their children, while the US government expels the other parent to Mexico alone. Expelled single adults are at no less risk of being kidnapped, raped, or otherwise harmed than families. The minimal exemption process that currently exists for Title 42 at just a handful of ports of entry does not comply with US law or international refugee obligations, as the UN High Commissioner has publicly stated. Some asylum seekers we met with, even in shelters in Juarez, where the process for exemptions has been running for several weeks, said that they were unaware of the process to request asylum at ports of entry or did not know how to contact the organizations running that process. Whether Black and Indigenous asylum seekers who often experience discrimination and language access barriers are able to access this exemption process that has not been publicly explained or advertised is also highly concerning. We reiterate our call to the Biden administration to immediately and fully end Title 42 expulsions and to restore asylum access at the border. Families and adults seeking protection in the United States should be treated with dignity, not subjected to detention. They should be welcomed and assisted to reach their destinations in the United States where they can stay with their families and communities while they continue their asylum process. My colleagues will have much more to say on the welcome that border communities are standing by, ready to offer. But I thank you for joining today's panel, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Diego. And Kenji, thank you so much for providing sort of that backdrop to what it looks like to welcome people and the opportunities that we have as NGOs, non-government organizations, and faith-based organizations to welcome folks into our country. So many of you may know that in 2019, end of 2018, beginning of 2019, many faith-based companies in border states in Texas and in New Mexico stood ready and prepared and provided welcoming services to asylum seekers at the border through a series of NGOs that provided that service, both in El Paso, in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in Deming, New Mexico, and all the way up into Albuquerque. Today I'm here representing an Albuquerque organization called the Five Site Council. And we do stand ready, even though we are in the interior. We are not a border city. Albuquerque is in the interior of New Mexico. We stand ready to help our colleagues and collaborators in the southern part of the state to do just that. So in 2019, just in the first 6 months, Albuquerque provided services to more than 5,000 individuals coming up through Albuquerque to get to their sponsors. And many, many more thousands of people were helped in the El Paso, Las Cruces and Deming area. And we stand ready once again to do that. We've been planning, all of the organizations that did this work in 2019 in particular have been planning for months, meeting for months, preparing ourselves, resourcing ourselves, gathering our volunteers, talking lots about how we do this in a different environment with COVID, and just being completely prepared to provide this humane, welcoming situation that we were able to perform in 2019. So today I'm representing the 5-site council in Albuquerque, which were the 5 sites in our city that welcomed folks. Those 5 sites were Lutheran Family Services, Catholic Charities, Albuquerque Interfaith, the Jewish Asylum Seeker Initiative, and St. Michael All Angels Episcopal Church and Diocese. And those 5 groups provided simultaneous services to folks coming up to New Mexico, up through from El Paso to Albuquerque on the way to their sponsors. This time around, we've sort of gathered and collaborated together as a way to be able to provide the service as one group. And so we call ourselves the 5-Site Council, representing those 5 sites, and we're prepared and resourced to do this work again. We do receive assistance from the Office of Immigration and Refugee Affairs in the city of Albuquerque, which is, our community as a whole, including our government officials, have stepped up and said, yes, we want to welcome folks. Yes, we can welcome folks. Yes, we can do this service in a humane and welcoming way. We do not need to do it any other way. We can do it. We can resource ourselves to do that. So we remain prepared. Unfortunately, the numbers are not warranting our service at this time. There are not people coming up from the border where we would be overwhelmed in the southern part of the state with some of those shelters not being able to provide all of the service and sending folks up to us, but we remain prepared, as do the other NGOs in the southern part of the state, Las Cruces, again, Deming, and El Paso. And so we are completely and ready to accept folks, and want to be clear that this work can be done by NGOs. This work can be done by faith-based communities. It can be done in a much better, we are experienced, we've done this. We know how to do this, we just want the opportunity to do that. And that will not happen until there's a wind down of all of the egregious policies that occurred in the previous administration that effectively made asylum seeking illegal, which it is not. And so we remain prepared and look forward to being able to provide our welcoming service. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jessica. Now we'll have Hannah, Hope's policy specialist.
Thank you. Good to be with you all today. So as Jessica and Kenji have been describing, our El Paso and New Mexico community is ready to welcome migrants and asylum seekers. We've been preparing since even before the current administration took office. In late 2020, we got together, groups from El Paso, from New Mexico, and we formed this Frontera Welcome Coalition, which is led by Hope and the Office of New Americans at the County of El Paso. And the reason we did that was to prepare our community, which includes advocates, volunteers, legal service providers, healthcare providers, of course, Annunciation House and the Shelter Network, to receive people, to receive migrants and asylum seekers the way we have for generations. We have amazing collaborators in this work. Jessica and the New Mexico folks, Annunciation House, the robust, the always ready network of volunteers who will drop everything when you call on them. And we have, many advocates who are constantly pushing for a better way when it comes to managing human movement. So we started this work early. We've been preparing, constantly. We meet on a weekly basis. We've made a lot of strides along the way. The Frontera Welcome Coalition and Hope and many people on this call have been partners in the NPP wind down process, helping to welcome people at our ports, make sure that they have transportation to the shelters, make sure that they have some information about next steps. We've advocated for resources like the $110 million in FEMA emergency food and shelter funds that was passed in March as part of the stimulus bill. We've joined forces with other welcome committees in border communities, from California to Arizona to New Mexico, Texas. So we've made a lot of strides, but we're still stuck. Our work is essentially being wasted right now while Title 42 remains in place. And instead of doing the work that we've been preparing to do, we're watching the harms of this policy play out in Juárez, in Palomas, Chihuahua, for example, and many other places across the border. We know that Title 42 was initially, it's written as a public health code, but the Biden administration's defense of the program has been to say that they don't have capacity. So the primary argument in defense has not been that public health needs to be protected, but that there's a lack of processing capacity. And Kenji spoke to, the ways that this program actually doesn't, puts people in the exact situations where they could contract COVID and then spread it. So the policy is not and has never been based on a public health necessity. That's something we've known since the beginning. And what's more, the argument about capacity, it does not hold true. This administration has had more than 6 months to scale capacity and improve processing. The resources are there. And our message as the Frontera Welcome Coalition since day one has been, we're ready. We're ready, we have resources, we have challenges with COVID, but we're gonna figure them out. So we've been saying that for a long time. So the argument about capacity is not really based on our reality at the border. In El Paso, Las Cruces, Albuquerque, Deming, we have a base capacity of about 2,000 beds. So Annunciation House is obviously the primary shelter network in El Paso, and then, if Annunciation House, gets full, we have the ability to send people to Las Cruces and Albuquerque, to bus them to different locations. And the capacity is really fluid. It can be expanded and contracted as needed. It's a really flexible network. We have a wealth of vaccinated volunteers, people who are ready and excited to help out. We have, access to the $110 million in the FEMA emergency food and shelter funds. We have great partnerships with the County of El Paso, with local governments, our local emergency management office. So we've built a lot. We've built out a lot of resources. Now that we have this capacity and this community heart and community willingness to do this work, which has always been there, we need a clear plan from the Biden administration about how it's planning to process people in and uphold their legal right to seek protection. Asylum is a human right. It's a legal means of seeking to migrate. Human movement is nothing new at the border, and very manageable. But what we need from the administration is a really bold vision, and we need them not to treat migrants and asylum seekers like a burden. And we can't resort to the same tools that we continue to use and that continue to fail. So criminalizing migration, detaining and deporting people, deterring people, along the journey in Mexico and Guatemala through force, empowering security forces to deter people, externalizing protection to Mexico, even though they don't have the same COVID resources and vaccines that are available in the US right now. So we can't keep doing that and expect something different to happen. We can't keep doing that and expect that people aren't going to get hurt. So Hope and our Frontera Welcome Coalition, our community, are ready to be partners in this journey, but we can't be the only ones who are preparing. We need them to meet us halfway to really create a plan about how this is going to happen, how we're going to unwind Title 42 immediately, right now, and welcome people with dignity. We also need to, make sure that that plan fundamentally respects, what it means to seek asylum, and that we're partnering with community shelters like Annunciation House instead of for-profit detention models like the Endeavors hotels. We have community capacity to do this very efficiently at a much lower cost and without resorting to detention. So we don't want to see this kind of for-profit model being replicated and being relied on, because we're, like I said, we have the heart, we have the resources, we have the infrastructure to do this and do it really well. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And the first question for Kenji from Sarah. Following on Kenji's description of migrants being told to try later, only to be kidnapped and or extorted, I wonder if there's any evidence of Border Patrol and or INM complicity in these sorts of criminal activities.
Thanks for that question, Sarah. So in terms of the Border Patrol, the thing that I think we most often hear is that Border Patrol agents throw out all of the belongings of people who are being expelled. And so they're often left with only perhaps their cell phone and some important documents, but that all of their other belongings are thrown in the trash, often in front of them, which is obviously highly distressing and means the loss of people's personal effects, but also medication and other important belongings that they have with them. In terms of issues with Mexican migration, in some locations along the border, there have been reports of sort of systematic ties between Mexican migration and groups that are kidnapping and extorting migrants. I haven't heard as much of that in the Juárez region, but maybe my colleagues can speak to that. What we did here this time in our research was people reporting that they had been robbed or extorted by migration officers, that they had been asked for bribes, or that their belongings had been taken from them, cell phones and those sorts of things. So there are, obviously concerns about the activities of migration officials on both sides in terms of their treatment of people who are in their custody.
Thank you, Kenji. Well, next question from Claudia, for anyone in our panel. ¿Cuáles son las cifras de migrantes que se han visto impactadas por Título 42? ¿Y cómo esto afecta a la ciudad fronteriza de Ciudad Juárez al tener que recibir a los migrantes? I'll try to do a loose translation of it. What are the numbers of migrants who have been impacted by Title 42? And how has this affected the border city of Juárez by receiving migrants? If you can answer that in Spanish, that would be great. Thank you.
Hannah, do you want to take this one actually?
Bueno, la verdad, la mera verdad es que no sabemos. Sí hay un número, creo que como alrededor de, bueno, le voy a pedir a Kenji que me dé el número exacto, pero la mera verdad es que no sabemos, porque esta política pone los migrantes en una situación en donde intentan cruzar varias veces. Obviamente, si te expulsan a Juárez, vas a, sin recursos, sin contactos en Juárez, sin acceso a albergues que ya están llenos, vas a intentar varias veces. Entonces, la cifra que nos da la patrulla fronteriza refleja un número de intentos, refleja muchos intentos por parte de diferentes personas. También sabemos que cuando expulsan a las familias, muchas veces hacen la decisión de mandar a sus niños solos, porque es tan peligroso en Juárez y en otras ciudades fronterizas que no no quieren que sus niños se queden en esa situación, entonces mandan a sus hijos solitos y luego se vuelven, son clasificados como menores no acompañados. Entonces, esta política no tenemos una idea muy clara de cuántas personas han sido afectadas, porque los pone en riesgo y básicamente desaparecen en el sistema, y es muy difícil de llegar a un número exacto.
And a follow-up question from Claudia, una pregunta adjunta a esa pregunta. Menciona que están listos para recibir a los migrantes. ¿Se han contactado con el gobierno para anunciarles esto? Además, ¿cuáles son las medidas de salud que tienen para poder retirar el título 42? And I'll do a loose translation of it. You mentioned that you're ready to receive migrants. Have you contacted the government about this? And what are the health or safety measures that you have in place to, remove Title 42?
So I would be happy to take this, but in English. I'll take the question in English and someone else can translate for me. My Spanish is not up to par to do that, but I can tell you that we have worked very diligently with subject experts on COVID. We have worked with the Department of Health. We have worked with MRC, the Medical Reserve Corps, in order to have our health team aware of and able to develop protocols to deal with COVID. And so on the health part of Title 42, we feel and stand ready to deal with that based on our several months of meetings, several months of collaboration with those organizations in order to develop protocols that will keep both the volunteers, the community at large, as well as our asylum seekers safe from COVID. And so, and also to the last question, I just want to also mention that Juárez and other border towns were not prepared for MPP. They were not prepared for Title 42 expulsions. They did not have time to prepare for any of those things, and they do not have, and have never had, the capacity or the infrastructure to deal with the numbers of folks that were being, summarily, expelled to their border towns. And so their lack of infrastructure, their lack of government support, their lack of finances and resources really led to an additional layer of danger for all of the folks that our country said, nope, can't come in. And so I just wanted to mention that they just have not been resourced through this entire period to deal with the numbers of folks that have been expelled by our government.
Sí, básicamente lo que dijo Jessica es que hemos estado trabajando con los gobiernos, tanto la administración de Biden como las organizaciones locales. Por ejemplo, Jessica menciona que en Albuquerque y en Nuevo México tienen entidades de seguridad pública y han estado trabajando constantemente con ellos para planear por un retiro del título 42. Y hemos estado también juntándonos mucho con, por ejemplo, la vicepresidenta Harris. Los directores de Hope estuvieron en la reunión con ella, también el secretario de DHS, Alejandro Mayorkas. Hemos estado trabajando con la administración para decirles que sí tenemos capacidad y que queremos colaborar en ser la solución a estas políticas que pueden depender de nosotros. Entonces sí hemos estado diciendo desde el principio, hay que preparar y nosotros estamos listos y estamos aquí para colaborar. Y la otra parte ¿cuáles medidas de salud que tienen para retirar el título 42? Tenemos mucho abasto de vacuna en Estados Unidos. Hay tanta vacuna que hay más vacuna que demanda, más vacuna que brazos. Entonces, tenemos la habilidad, tenemos los recursos de dar una prueba de COVID a cada quien que entra, de también ofrecerles una vacuna, de ofrecer una cuarentena para las personas que salen positivas. Tenemos suficientes recursos y pero también en México, donde no fueron preparados, no recibieron recursos para enfrentar la política de MPP ni de título 42. Entonces, no, en México el programa de vacunación va muy lento y no tienen todavía suficientes vacunas, suficientes recursos. Entonces, estamos básicamente poniendo este labor de recibir a las personas encima de un país que no tiene los mismos recursos que nosotros. Y es ha sido un gran reto. Hay organizaciones en Juárez y en México que están haciendo un trabajo increíble, que han respondido de manera con mucha compasión y con mucho amor para recibir a los migrantes, pero no es justo que digamos, nosotros nos queremos proteger del COVID-19 en Estados Unidos, pero no tenemos que proteger a México. No es justo.
Thank you, Hannah. Julian's or Julian's question. Do you think recent violent developments in Haiti will lead to more families leaving that country and coming to the border? How are you preparing to assist these non-Spanish speaking migrants, and how can they be protected as they pass through Mexico? Question for anyone in the panel.
I can start on this one. Already many Haitian families and adults are arriving at the southern border. And one concerning thing that we had seen is that very few of them are able to access that exemption process that exists currently for Title 42. Most Haitian families and adults are crossing the border between ports of entry. And our colleagues were in El Paso and Ciudad Juárez at the same time we were visiting, and they let us know from Haitian Bridge Alliance that many of the Haitian asylum seekers they spoke to were just unaware that that process even existed and that there was any way to seek asylum at a port of entry. So I think that's one of the concerns that we have about these kind of piecemeal approaches to restoring access to asylum is that the people who have the least access, who experience the most discrimination, won't be able to figure out how to seek asylum when it just simply isn't available at ports of entry like it should be. And those colleagues from Haitian Bridge Alliance have also been visiting with shelters and with government officials to talk about ways to increase capacity to provide services in Haitian Creole in a language that people speak and understand the best. Often, a lot of the services that are provided, including by the government, are done in a language that is not the best language of the person. So we see a lot of Indigenous people who are asked to go through immigration processes in Spanish, even though it's not a language that they're fluent in. And the same for Haitian Creole speakers from Haiti, who have spent in some cases a significant amount of time crossing through Spanish-speaking countries, and so who have picked up some Spanish, but who are not fluent in it. And so it's not an ideal situation for them to be asked to do their immigration processes, even the ones just with Border Patrol or at the border, in a language they don't fully understand. And it also creates barriers to medical care for urgent issues that arise. People aren't able to fully explain what's happening to them and what kind of help they need. And that's what led to the deaths, contributed to the deaths of many of the children that died in TVP custody that we saw a number of years ago, that lack of language access. So that's definitely a concern, not just for service providers, but also for the government in terms of ensuring that people are met and spoken to in a language they understand.
And if I just might add that language access is an issue that several NGOs have taken up with the government around immigration, around lots of issues, but around immigration, language access has been one of those high issues that have been raised repeatedly in an effort to protect people. As Kenji said, we can't protect people, we can't educate people, we can't let people know what's going on and what they need to do if we're not allowing them to understand what the rules are. And that is an obligation that we have we meaning the United States, to provide language access to all folks who are coming to our borders.
Thank you. The next question comes from Andrew. has Title 42 largely replaced, taking the place of the previous MPP? What differences are there between those two policies?
Maybe I can start on this one broadly, and then Hannah, if you want to talk specifically about what's happening in El Paso and Juarez. So the migrant protection protocols effectively stopped returning people to Mexico when the Biden administration took office. So as of January, late January 2021, people stopped being returned to Mexico under MPP. But the Title 42 policy, which began in March of 2020, continued during the transition and up till now. So that's the policy that's currently seeing people expelled or blocked in Mexico from seeking protection. And under MPP, people were placed in immigration court proceedings. They were given a date for a hearing, and those proceedings were often a farce. People, really didn't have access to attorneys or a real opportunity to prepare their cases, given the conditions they were living in, the dangers they were facing. Under Title 42, people are just expelled. They're not placed in immigration proceedings. There's not going to be a process later within that for them to apply for asylum. They're simply forced back across the border. And so Title 42 is currently the process that's being used to block people from access to asylum, similar to what MPP was doing. And just one last thing I would say is that the dangers of people being sent back to Mexico were documented by many groups and reporters and academics, advocates under the migrant protection protocols. And frankly, they're nearly identical to the issues that come up with Title 42 expulsions, including what we just saw in terms of people being targeted immediately after being returned. That's often what we saw under MPP because people had to come back and forth to the port of entry multiple times for their hearings under the migrant protection protocols. And so they were easy targets. And similarly, people who are being returned under Title 42, it's evident who they are. They're walked to the center of the bridge by a Border Patrol agent or another government official. Often they've had their shoelaces taken from them. They're all wearing the same mask that was issued to them by the Border Patrol. So it's very clear who the groups of people are who are being sent back. And they're very obvious targets when they don't have somewhere to go. They're not able to find a shelter bed to take them in. And that's why people are getting kidnapped and exploited right after their return in Juarez. And conditions are even worse for people who are sent back to some of the smaller ports of entry where there's frankly just no services whatsoever.
Yeah, I'll just add that we've also seen some kind of sinister, iterations of the Title 42 policy, or, certain practices that are very, very disturbing and harmful, like flying people, from the Rio Grande Valley to El Paso and then expelling them here. So all the resources that go into, getting a flight together, you're putting people in a congregate setting. A lot of people don't know where they're going, or they're told that they're going into the US to a shelter, and then they're just expelled in an area that they know nothing about. So that's been one kind of new wrinkle. And then, like Kenji mentioned, people are being expelled to Palomas, Chihuahua, which is like 2 hours outside of Juarez. And we've seen a lot of people expelled there who have extremely severe injuries, like broken legs or broken, backs. And they're expelled there. There's no medical infrastructure in Palomas. So very similar harms, but, also just different ways that manifests itself.
Thank you. The next question will be from Belisa. What is the criteria for Title 42 exceptions? What about Cubans and Venezuelans? Are they being returned in large numbers?
So in terms of the exemption process, that really isn't publicly available. That hasn't been described publicly. What's available in media is pretty limited. And so, as you can imagine, for asylum seekers who are trying to get access to that exemption process, it's even more difficult to figure out what those criteria are, or if there are. And so that we heard a lot of frustration from people who had tried to contact that exemption process, tried to get registered, not understanding what information they needed to provide or what information would make them eligible for an exemption. So I think that's a source of major confusion. And it's needless because the solution here is obvious. It's not to have an exemption process, it's to restore asylum at the ports of entry. To your question about Cubans and Venezuelans, yes, we interviewed a number of Cuban and Venezuelan individuals and families. Many of them had been expelled on those lateral flights that Hannah was just mentioning that came from Del Rio earlier in the month. So there were still people weeks later waiting in shelters for an opportunity to seek asylum. One of those people that we profiled in the report was a Venezuelan police commissioner who had actually fled with her 2 adult sons after receiving threats. Others were, Cuban asylum seekers fleeing political persecution. We also met folks from Nicaragua who were on those lateral expulsion flights. And of course, there were many people from Central America, and also highly concerning, many Mexican asylum seekers who are blocked in their country of persecution, in the country that they're fleeing. So there's some question in my mind about what's going on because the public agreements between the US and Mexico seem to indicate that only Mexican nationals and folks who are from the 3 Central American countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador can be returned to Mexico under Title 42, but it's evident that many other nationalities are also being returned under Title 42.
And I think also just the lack of transparency that's most concerning to us is that we have opportunities to meet with policymakers and other government officials from Washington, and they seem to not even know. And so, that lack of transparency just is mind-blowing to all of us who are trying to do this work.
Thank you. Is there hope of getting out from under the for-profit deportation machine when orgs like Geo Group and Core Civic support candidates like Biden to a very expensive degree?
Yeah, we know that I don't have a lot of knowledge about contributions to Biden, so I won't touch that part, but we do know that there are a lot of companies and businesses that are involved in the immigration system. For example, locally, we've had the example of Endeavors, which is a nonprofit, but does kind of work like a business. And they received a massive contract, I think $89 million, to house families in hotels in a contract with ICE. And so those families, even though it looks like the services are pretty good there, but it's still a detention system because it's, they're contracting with ICE, and people who are staying in those hotels are essentially in custody. They are in custody. So that's been another, typically at the border, we have had this partnership with organizations like Annunciation House that don't accept government funding and that are supported with donations and with community support. So, and then we look and we see, a massive organization getting a very large contract like that to do the work that basically communities do for free. So that is very troubling, and we've been pushing back against that consistently because it's just not right to hold people in detention, especially when there's a non-detention option available that's even better and that's very efficient and flexible. So yeah, if we keep replicating these same patterns, we're not going to expect to see different results or less harm.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. We have been hearing and writing about migrants being kidnapped and extorted in Juárez for the past 2 years. Why have the conditions not improved during that time? What partners south of the border need to be at the table to improve this situation?
Juárez is part of our community. We are a binational community, and Juárez is, we're like one region. And so, we never want to demonize Juárez. And we also want to see, we also see very clearly that there are actors in, northern Mexico. This is, also true in places like in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Reynosa. There are these, groups that prey on migrants, and the migratory space, the territory, is controlled by criminal groups. And so, the default response over time has been to deter people. So relying on security forces, relying on, different partners in Mexico, INM, the Mexican Immigration Institute, like sort of empowering them to replicate the American model of detaining people, deporting people, blocking them along the journey. So that's been our approach as a country. And what that does is it just funnels people into more dangerous pathways. If someone can't go to a port of entry, by themselves, they're going to pay a coyote to cross them, in a more remote area. And that's something that we have seen for like 20, 30 years. It's nothing new. It's a pattern that we already know exists. Because, as with any other public health issue, we know that, abstaining or deterring is never a solution that is going to work. So in order to like close that space for the cartels and for criminal groups that prey on migrants, in order to shrink that space that they take advantage of, we need to increase the space that the US government is taking up. And what I mean by that is opening and resourcing the ports of entry to receive people, creating legal pathways, and that would go a long way towards shrinking the space that cartels and criminal groups and different people can take up. We have amazing partners in Juárez, like Derechos Humanos Integrales en Acción, amazing organization that we work with. Hope has the BRAF, Border Refugee Assistance Fund, and we support a lot of the shelters and a lot of the different entities in Juárez that are supporting migrants. So the community there, our community has really stepped up to support people, but there's also this, this reality that US policy does empower exploitation of migrants in this way. And so, yeah, we can't improve that situation without recognizing that our own policy is feeding into that.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that. I will just say, to be explicit, policies like the Migrant Protection Protocols and Title 42 that block people in Mexico, that return them to Mexico and force them to wait there or leave them stranded there, are essentially turning these folks who are already vulnerable, already fleeing persecution and torture, essentially into like a cash machine for people who are looking to take advantage of the fact that they're vulnerable. And of course, their families in the United States and back home are willing to pay whatever it takes to save their lives. And so the United States government has long known that that's happening, but continues to use these policies that are returning people to known dangers. And in fact, the Vice President even mentioned as much in her remarks 2 weeks ago. She said something to the effect of, we know the dangers that people face en route to the United States, and yet we're continuing to send people back to that place where we know they face danger. So.
Thank you. I think we have a time for just one last question from Claudia. En Spanish, ¿pudieran hablar sobre los riesgos que enfrentan los migrantes al ser expulsados por el título 42 y cuándo se pudiera esperar el fin de esa medida? ¿Cuáles son las razones por las que el gobierno de Biden ha decidido continuar con él? And I'll try to do a loose translation of it. Could you talk about the risks of that migrants, are being exposed to by being expelled under Title 42? Should we expect an ending to this policy? What are the reasons that the government, the Biden administration has decided to continue upholding Title 42?
Yo puedo empezar con la respuesta. Pues al ser expulsados, las personas que están buscando asilo o refugio en Estados Unidos enfrentan muchos riesgos en México. Secuestros, violación, ataques muy violentos. Las vidas de las personas expulsadas a México corren peligro. Que hemos visto personas que fueron lastimadas severamente después de expulsiones a México, y anteriormente con el programa de MPP, varias personas perdieron sus vidas esperando su proceso en México. Entonces, podemos decir que las personas expulsadas a México pueden perder sus vidas después de ser expulsados allá. Con la pregunta de cuándo la administración de Biden va a quitar o frenar esta política, no sabemos. Hemos leído como todos los informes en los medios de comunicación que hay planes de frenar la política, pero solamente para familias al fin de este mes, quizás, pero no sabemos muy bien porque no hay transparencia de esta administración con las organizaciones, con el público, con los migrantes, de lo que va a pasar con las políticas de la frontera. Y la pregunta de por qué han contenido con esta política tan peligrosa. Yo no sé, porque no tiene sentido. No es una política que tiene algo que ver con la salud pública. No tiene nada que ver con protección de migrantes. No es una violación de la ley de los Estados Unidos y las obligaciones internacionales en la protección de personas buscando refugio. A mí me parece que es una cuestión de política. Es un asunto de Washington, no es un asunto que es sobre las vidas y de las personas en que nosotros estamos practicando hoy. Es algo para los políticos que tienen sus intereses.
Solamente quiero agregar que título 42, según lo que, bueno, la política es una de seguridad pública, o de salud pública, pero la verdad es que es un riesgo a la salud pública. Cuando expulsas a las personas que ya han sido contenidas, detenidas, expuestas al COVID, y los expulsas a un lugar donde corre mucho riesgo, corre mucho peligro, es muy peligroso, está totalmente en contra de lo que significa la salud pública. Y también sabemos que en términos de, si lo vemos así, si vemos a los impactos de este programa como amenaza a la salud pública, sabemos que en términos de la salud, cuando estamos hablando cuando estamos hablando de soluciones a problemas de salud pública, la solución nunca es decir no lo hagas. O sea, decir a las personas no hagas esto porque está mal, nunca funciona. Nunca ha funcionado en la historia del mundo. La solución es decir, esto es como vamos a ofrecer esta solución, vamos a abrir la puerta a los solicitantes de asilo. No vamos a decir que no vengan, porque no va a funcionar y va a dañar a mucha gente, y ha dañado a mucha gente.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all our panelists, Kenji, Hannah, Jessica. A reminder that we will have the report. It's live on our websites, humanrightsfirst.org and hopewater.org. You can find the reports there, the report there on each website. I want to thank everyone who's at every panelist and every attendee to this webinar. We hope to see you again soon for our next webinar or for a future project. I want to thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Gracias y buen día.
Thank you.